For those that don't know, Elsawy is a product and design leader, and it's currently a product leader at Loeb Law Digital. That one gets you a little bit. He's a distinguished product maker, having worked at companies such as Tangerine, Hudson Bay, RBC, Manulife, just to name a few. You've got a super impressive resume, and I was looking through some of your LinkedIn over the last couple of days, and you're also launching a podcast as well. Is that true?
It is. It's terrifying, but true. Yes.
Yeah. Awesome. It's a lot of work, isn't it? So there's a lot more to it.
Absolutely.
Brilliant. All right. So today, Elsawy is going to be talking about building trusting relationships for better product outcomes and quality. And as always, we'll be kicking off this session. I'll be handing over to Elsawy, and any questions from the listeners, please drop them in the comments. If you're listening on LinkedIn Live, drop them in the comments and we'll pull them through. And then we'll have a Q&A section at the end as well. So we'll leave about 10 to 15 minutes for that. So what I'll do is I'll hand over to you, Elsawy.
People, my name is Elsawy. Thanks for getting the pronunciation right. I know I challenged people a little bit with my name. I'm excited, I'm grateful, and slightly nervous, but in a good way, to be speaking to all of you today. The topic of today around building trust, especially in the context of product and product management and work relationships, has, let's say, fascinated me for many years. And I'm here to share with you some practical tips, learnings, and hopefully insights that worked for me personally. I count on your engagement, and I hope to make this session successful. So let's get started. I'll start with a question just to get things going. Have you ever heard people at work say things like this? We're unsure if they have a solid roadmap, said one maybe stakeholder. It's like it's not working. Suspense factor. 1 second. I'm going to close my panelist view here and go back to my presentation. Okay. They don't seem to understand our business needs. The SLT, senior leadership team, sets initiatives and priorities, which are then given down to a product team for execution. Establishing credibility through delivery is key before the business, using single quotes, green lights any discovery work, said one hypothetical manager. They don't take our feedback seriously. We don't have visibility into their decision-making process. We're concerned about their lack of experience in managing this product, and I don't understand why I'm designing this feature. So these are potentially hypothetical quotes that you might have heard in your career, in your professional life. Typically, you'll find they're in third person, so people don't talk about these issues or mention quotes like this when you are in the room. You rarely hear it directly said to you. But what they all of these statements, what they boil down to is that they're really saying, I don't trust you. And I know that hurts a little bit, but there's a couple of things to remember here. Often it's not really your fault as a product person. It's not really your own doing that results in that. It's more common than one might think, the issue of the lack of trust. And building trust in general is a skill that you can learn, hone, and grow. And as I kind of talk now that I introduced the word trust, I think it's important to align a little bit on the meaning because it's subjective, it's loaded. And what better way but to, in a maybe slightly sarcastic way as well, put it in a user story format. And I'm not going to go into the debate about user stories and their benefits, but thinking about as a product maker, I want to build trust with my team members and stakeholders so we can create meaningful products for our customers. I underline the word trust because I think in general, to gain trust, almost a meta property around that is aligning on what do we mean when we use certain terms. So I start by my definition of what I think trust is about. First, I think it's really a mental attitude towards the value proposition that you bring as a product person, as a product maker, and that attitude towards that value proposition. What value do you drive? It's a set of behaviors from the people that you work with, stakeholders, colleagues that you collaborate with that demonstrate that they can really depend on you. And it's also that emotion that is felt by others about you, especially when you're not in the room, given some of the examples that I gave earlier. So your stakeholders level confidence and security that they can think of you as a partner that not only cares about them in a personal way, but you also care about what they care about. What are their business goals? What are their customer goals? And how can you help them achieve? So this is really what I mean by that loaded word, trust. Now that we aligned on meaning, and I gave you a little bit on the context of all of that, I realized I missed one more, which is really the belief in the probability that you as a product maker will behave in a certain way that's predictable. With that in mind, I think I have 10 important ways that I want to share with you. I know that it might be cognitively overwhelming, so I'll try to my best to gain your trust in the process. I'll use a consistent way on going through each one of these. Then we're going to have a recap together, and hopefully you'll find it useful as we go through it. So the first way around creating trust is what I call learn before recommend, or learning before recommending. At a very high level, it's really about prioritizing your learning before giving your recommendation and before suggesting solutions. This is very important. It's very applicable in multiple contexts that we're going to go through it. But let me explain why it works, because it exhibits a sense of self-control. It exhibits that while you may have an impulse to suggest different solutions or ideas, you're actually taking the time to understand the context, to build your own internal discovery around the problem space that you're in, and that exhibits self-control. The second one is about, it strengthens your proposed hypothesis. So as you take time and you gather more data about something before you give a recommendation on a direction, whether it's product strategy or a solution that you have, really helps you build that hypothesis out of it. And finally, it raises the perceived value of your recommendation. When people understand the concept of paying for effort, and they see through the ability and the effort that you put in to come up with a recommendation, the perceived value of whatever recommendation that you put forward is much more higher. In practice, what does that look like? Maybe you started a new product role and you're asked to create maybe an org chart. What is your optimum org chart, or a roadmap of some sort? Or maybe you're asked to solve a specific customer problem. What do? You choose to learn before you recommend. You spend the time understanding that problem space and building that discovery around it. Here's another example. You have a very opinionated group of stakeholders, and they have very different priorities and different goals. And rather than picking one direction or choosing one solution and proposing it, you choose to facilitate a workshop that helps align everyone around a single objective. This is another example of choosing to learn before you recommend. That's really our first tactic, learning before recommending. Our second is one that you're finally doing a lot, which is recapping your understanding. It's really about summarizing comprehension. Being able to take something in, listen to it, and then recap what you understood to the person that was providing that information. Why does that work as a trust building tactic? Because it demonstrates that you're an active listener. It de-risks any misunderstanding where you leave the room with maybe a different picture or a different version of what you heard. So that's quite important, but it also projects your own product competence. After all, as product people, we are meant to be, and we need to be good listeners, and being able to sense, make, and understand, and doing that playback helps quite a lot. Let's take some practical examples of that. You've listened to a stakeholder, they shared their business goals, you actively listened, you took notes around it, and then you rephrased your understanding and asked for confirmation. Things like, can I just make sure that I understood what you said? So you mentioned 1, 2, and 3. Is that a correct representation of where your goals are? Something like that. That would be a high-level template. Another example is you interviewed a customer. Maybe you were involved in some customer research, and they spoke for 5 minutes straight, and then you actually took the time to bring it back, recap, and say, all right, I understand the problems that you have with our product. Let me summarize them so I can make sure that I got what you said. So understanding and then confirming that with them. would be an example of putting that recapping of your understanding into practice. The third is about framing problems. But what makes this one unique as a tactic that I find very beneficial is framing problems in an empathetic way with a lot of empathy. So articulating problems from the perspective or the frame of your stakeholder or your colleague or your partner that you're working with. So why it works? Because it really shows that you authentically care. You cared about understanding their point of view and reference, and being able to frame that problem from their perspectives matters a lot. It aligns on outcomes because you're obviously going to get a lot of support when you frame a problem from the perspective of your stakeholder or partner. And it also creates help dynamics, meaning that once they understand that you're genuinely interested in solving some problems, when the time comes and you can go, sorry, it sounds a little bit like a line from the Godfather, but when the time comes and you ask for a favor, they're going to be 100% aligned in terms of helping reciprocate that help that they received because you showed that empathy. In practice, what does this look like? You include multiple problem frames in your product brief. So that's a good example as a potential direction. And you frame these problems from the perspective of your stakeholders. The second is maybe you shared and aligned with your stakeholders and product team on a set of customer problems that you're solving this quarter. And you did that, again, together as a team with empathy involved. Now, let's go to the next one. Delivering on micro promises. I don't know if I coined this term or it existed before. If it existed, then I won't take credit for it. But this is the idea of making small commitments, but doing that and fulfilling these commitments in a consistent manner. I find that maybe was influenced by just understanding the true essence of being iterative and how we do work. And I think applying that in a sense of building relationships and building trust. So why it works, why does making small promises and fulfilling them works, is that it's easy to get started. So it's really small iterative cycles where you can take something that is manageable, make the ability or make a promise around delivering it and reminding the person, that stakeholder, that partner, that as promised, I delivered on this thing. So that definitely raises the trust and the credibility. It also de-risks credibility building because you're not taking big bets. You're not making big promises upfront. So there isn't necessarily a big inherent risk in having micro promises because these are small things that you can achieve. It also primes for recognition. So as I said, in a template in conversation, if you start saying things in communication, even in writing, when you say things as promised, we did this, it primes people to recognize that you're someone that delivers on their promises. In practice, what does that look like? Maybe you discovered a set of pain points for your own team, for your customers, or for your stakeholders, and you created a working solution to address something around it. And then you started a message with, as promised, I worked on this. Maybe the promise was not explicit, but when you recapped or when you went back to connect on that, you mentioned that prime, which I think is important. You realize that another example could be that you realize that there's two parties in your network and they have a common preference or a common interest in something or a common goal, and you connect them and you make introductions. So that's another example of promising people that they're going to connect them on a topic, and helping them is another example of that tactic. Our next one is really around engaging partners and stakeholders throughout the journey. And what do I mean by that? It's really about maintaining involvement throughout, bringing people along the journey, whether it's discovery around a certain problem or a product that you're trying to build. And I think this is key to bring them along the journey from the get-go. Why it works is that it obviously creates a set of alignment on the opportunities. It produces a lot of what we call the endowment effect. People feel that I am part of this journey, and because of that, I own it. We value things that we own, and giving people the perspective that they own something because they were involved from the get-go, they were part of baking the pie, so to speak, helps quite a lot. And finally, it also acknowledges this diverse expertise that you can bring together and work throughout the journey of both the problem space and the solution space. Just want to give you some examples on how is this in practice, but maybe it's about you introducing a new prioritization framework, saying, oh, we need to objectively prioritize how we roll out our features. You introduce that prioritization framework, then you invite different team members and stakeholders to prioritize together. So that's an example of bringing people along the journey, so you can remind them of how they were involved in this activity of prioritization. Bringing stakeholders along for research, I think, is a really good one. You bring a stakeholder to a customer interview or even a research synthesis session, and potentially making them watch and interact and seeing people watch and interact with your product. These are all good examples. Just want to take a quick pause just to check if you're with me, if I'm audible, if going well before I move forward. We're kind of almost up. Just a quick check here.
Yeah, all good. I've had a few questions come through, but I think we can tackle those. Their audio is kind of cutting a little bit in and out, but it's generally good.
Okay. So I'll carry on, and if I'm still choppy, please let me know. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Kevin.
I think you're pretty good. We get some good comments in the chat as well that they can mostly hear you. So that's awesome. Yeah, keep going. This is brilliant.
Awesome. Okay. Well, the next one is all about making your work transparent, and we'll use the same consistent structure to go through it. How do you ensure that the tasks and the things that you're working on are transparent to your partners, to your stakeholders, meaning giving them visibility into that roadmap, not a big reveal at the end, giving them visibility into what features are keeping you busy, what kind of discovery work that you're doing, and making that work transparent. So rather than focus on things like updates and providing them, give them the tools, give them the ability to be able to get into your work in a good way and be able to find out more information about what's keeping you busy, what's on your mind, how you're helping solve their problems. Why it works? Because it provides a sense of control. People like a sense of control in general. I don't know if everyone knows, but there was this study, and I think it was actually based in New York, around how the signals, the crossing signals, the pedestrian crossing signals, and how a lot of them are actually offline, but they yet keep them in place just to give the illusion to people that they're actually controlling that. Same thing with elevators. So the idea of giving that sense of control makes a big difference on building trust. It also aids in decision making because as someone who's external to your work, understanding what you're busy with, understanding what's on your mind and the challenges that you have and the work that you're doing helps me decide if it's yet another thing that I need to ask for, helps me decide and understand what you're working on and how you're helping solve my problems. It also sets up value exchange dynamics, which we kind of spoke about, but basically it's, I see you're working on this other thing. Let me connect you with someone else. Let me help you connect with someone else because you made the work transparent, not in a form of formal updates, but more you made it an open box for people. In practice, it could be things like sharing real-time product roadmap with context on structure and changes. This is something that your stakeholders and partners can go in and find out, and it's all real-time. It's part of your working artifacts, and you're making it visible for them. Building OKR dashboards for all your stakeholders to access at any time. So there isn't that initial or that constant pull of, how are we doing on this thing? Can you provide me an update on that? Because you made the work transparent. And the next one is really about habitualizing. It's a big word to pronounce, but making habits or creating habits around progress sharing. So cultivating the habits of sharing progress. And why it works is that it raises predictability. If people know that there are certain rituals that they're going to be involved in, whether they're customers, stakeholders, partners, even team members, they have a sense of predictability. And predictability encourages and builds trust. And that comes through consistency. Waking up in the morning, realize if I was to tell you, every night you go to bed, you're going to wake up somewhere else. It's not predictable. Every time you speak to a person, they won't be consistent. They react very differently. Your trust is affected and eroded by time. The second is that it really sets self-accountability. You're basically setting up these rituals about sharing progress, and you're holding yourself accountable, which creates a good kind of pressure on yourself and accountability that you can project through this. So which is basically really around responsibility and authority coming together. And the third is it raises the confidence in your value delivery. When people see your progress, when you're doing this sharing constantly and it's predictable, they see and they have that confidence, and as a result, of course, trust. In practice, it could look like setting up quarterly planning sessions for the year upfront, where people already see these on their calendars. They understand that these are the sessions we're going to come together and we're going to plan as a team. They can also be things around sharing product demos and doing that consistently, and how that I think also really affects building trust. The next, and the progress bar is almost all the way at the top. It's a bit of progressive disclosure, which is another principle that I love in design. But I'll talk about communicating with confidence. I wrote these two words, assertive communication. What I really mean by it is being able to communicate with confidence. And I'll give you some real examples about that in a second. But why does assertive communication matter for a product maker, for product managers, for a product person? I like to make sure that these labels are inclusive in nature. So, because number one, it affirms the right of authority. And I don't mean authority here as in this top-down, do what I say because of my title. Because as product makers, a lot of the authority that you get is through influence. It's not through a reporting line. So the authority that I'm talking about here is through sound arguments and solid product thinking. The second one is it asserts clarity of direction. When people come across as confidence and assertive in what they know and can explain it in an easy, concise way, that asserts that clarity of direction and avoids a lot of spin for your team, even for yourself. And finally, it decreases that decision uncertainty. We don't know what we're going to do. Anytime you find that there is hesitation, and by the way, not to be confused with being right all the time or coming across as like we know all the answers and we don't have any doubt, but being confident in the next step and assertive on how we communicate it. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we plan to learn, and here's how we can pivot moving forward. Keeping that in mind is critical. Finally, in practice, maybe it's about sharing your sprint goals upfront with your stakeholders and partners, but also coming back and communicating with confidence and saying, here's what we plan to do, and here's what we released when it's shipped. So that's an example of communicating with confidence with assertiveness. Another example is providing focused answers. People would ask you questions all the time. Being able to answer these questions on topic, so on scope of the question. Question could be related to timeline, to a scope of a certain initiative, the purpose behind it, but doing that in a prompt manner. So doing that promptly, concisely, and with a clear POV. Anytime you're saying or, and, but, maybe, and it really weakens the assertiveness of your communication. Less than 60 seconds is great. If you can answer a question in 60 seconds or less, that would be even better. And now I talk about understanding joint value, which is another tactic that I quite like and put into practice quite a lot. So having a comprehensive understanding of the shared values. We all have different values. A little bit tricky because values are open for interpretation. And sometimes people would say we have this value of integrity or innovation or something quite abstract and subjective. But then when you better understand what they mean by it, you might find that it means something different. But a high level understanding of this, the values of your partners, your stakeholders, the people that you want to build trust with is critical. Why it works? Because it acts as a persuasion lever. And I don't mean that in a manipulative sense to say, oh, well, this person's value is as such, let me manipulate them into something. But understanding that perspective on how do they value and what do they value helps you persuade them and helps you put them, create better arguments when you're showcasing or where you're proposing something for their buy-in. It also sets guardrails around trust, and it protects you from, maybe betrayal is a strong word, going back to the Godfather references, but it might be too strong to say. But the idea is that if you understand someone's values, you kind of expect already how they're going to react if they act in accordance to these values. So here's an example. When you request behavioral advice, so you ask for behavioral advice from a stakeholder, sharing their advice, being a bit vulnerable, just like maybe I started the presentation today, but requesting that behavioral advice and say, you know what, I'm facing this challenge. What do you think? A lot of the time you'll find that when people give advice, their values are reflected. So it's an indirect way for you to understand what do they care about and how do they see things without necessarily giving them the question of like, what are your values? Let me put them down, because it doesn't really work that way. And people struggle to sometimes articulate what these values are. Facilitating a team charter workshop, I find very interesting, and bringing people together, asking them questions around it, whether it's for a new project or or maybe like a team formation or even a cross-functional endeavor. With that, I will go to owning up and acknowledging wins. And our final tactic, and I hope you're still with me and I didn't blow up your brain just yet. So what is it really about? It's about taking responsibility and recognizing achievements. So what I mean by that is, being able to recognize that you're not perfect as a product maker. You make mistakes. You take responsibilities for these mistakes or mishaps, and you take the learnings out of them. But you also celebrate and recognize the achievements, mostly for others, even so more than you. And why it works? Because it reduces fear and it increases learning. What I mean by that is that if people feel that they have this psychological space, whether it's your working team or your partners, they don't need to fear that they messed up on something or made a mistake. And obviously, you make it more of a learning culture that you create around that. It also motivates people through genuine recognition that matters, coming from certain people from a certain perspective, and it creates that psychological safety that I was talking about. In practice, we didn't, we found a production bug. This is an interesting one. So you apologize. You say, look, this is on us. We found a production bug that impacted maybe revenue, and you explain how you're going to go about resolving it. So taking responsibility, I think, is very important. The second is recognizing a team member based on their preferences and interests. I find this one very interesting because not everybody amongst your team members, your stakeholders and partners like to be recognized the same way. So finding out how they like to be recognized and honoring that in terms of the preferences and putting that into action, recognizing them that way that they prefer, makes a big difference. With that, just want to congratulate you because I went through this very quickly. We covered 10 different items and ways to create trust. I hope you found this useful. And I leave with a very important question before we go to the Q&A, is just making sure that it doesn't come across that this is a bulletproof formula that guarantees trust. It's a very important caveat that, the answer is there is no bulletproof. These are just ways that, we can put into practice as product makers to help us build that trust with our stakeholders, with our partners, with our working teams. And that you have to know that maybe a bit philosophical here, but there's good people in general. And there's also, let's say, I don't want to say bad people or evil people, let's say not very great people, and yet you have to work with them. So in a lot of cases, when some of these tactics don't work as expected, you resort to what's called trust substitutes. And the idea around it is various methods that can compensate for that lack of trust. Usually they're expensive and difficult to put in place. So I wouldn't recommend you start with that. These are things like putting rules or agreements micromanagement, which I personally hate, consequences for certain actions, but those do exist and they have their place. The caveat that I wanted to put out is not to start with them. Here's what I'm going to do. Recap. Hope that rings a bell from earlier. We started by talking about the goal and motivation for building trust. I hope we aligned on what does it mean, and I kind of gave you my own explanation of what does trust mean. Then we went together through 10 different ways to build trust, where we explain what the thing was or the tactic was, we explain why it works, and we finally went through some practical examples on each. With that, I have some open questions for the chat. I'm not expecting all of them are going to be answered, but I'll go through them. I'll stop talking, stop sharing my screen right after. But I'd love for you to think about how does delivering on micro promises help you build trust, which is something we went through. What's an example of engaging your stakeholders throughout the journey? Answering the question promptly, concisely, and with a clear POV is an example of what trust building tactic that we covered. And what's an example of making your work transparent? And what trust building tactic resonated with you, the audience, the most? And maybe when we do all of these things, you'll hear more of this magical phrase or statement, I trust you, and then you know you have a real partner. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Lots of really good just feedback around how much this resonated. Like it certainly resonated a lot with me in terms of my journey. Yeah, just a lot of folks kind of reiterating things that you mentioned in terms of just it's really helpful to have these principles articulated. What was some other ones here? Some of the comments. It perfectly maps to what I've learned over the last couple of years. So I think a lot of this really resonated with folks. I did have a few questions that were sent through to me. So if we could dive into those. Another question that came through was around engaging throughout the journey as a theme. And this is a question that I've heard before, but some folks, perhaps a little bit more junior, might feel not capable to kind of bring others, especially more senior people on the journey with them. How would you recommend they approach that to get started? So I'll give you an example, and this is one that I've heard before, and it's similar to the question that came through, is I want to get more people on the journey with me, but I'm not sure what to present them or how to structure it. You might be feeling a little bit nervous to kind of bring them into a workshop and go through that process. In your experience, do you have any advice for how they could approach that or start to approach bringing people on the journey?
Yeah, maybe I'll give three quick things. One is in particular that a tactic that I think I find very beneficial, which is all around role playing, to build your confidence. In advance. Let's say it's a big workshop, you haven't done it before, you're a bit intimidated by, let's say, some of the titles and the people involved. Mm-hmm. Doing a dry run with people that you trust and create a safe space, going through it together quite extensively helps. The more prepared you are, obviously, the better. So that's one. Second, I think you can find I want to say a proxy, but a trust broker of sorts. Mm-hmm. Someone that already has a strong relationship with stakeholder A, B, and can help you expect certain questions that they're going to have, can help introduce you in the session the right way, can help maintain maybe the conversation, and in no way shield you. I don't want to say like shield you from any potential challenges around that because you're a new person and you're doing it for the first time. So that's number two. First is role playing. Second, and dry runs. And second is around finding a proxy or person that can help you, a broker, trust broker, let's call them that. And then third, just I think this is very useful, is ask questions. Go directly to these stakeholders, and everybody was in a situation like you, and people in general are genuinely trying to help. So asking people, what would you expect in something like this? How do I make it better? And you're not necessarily asking for advice. You're not asking for feedback. You're asking for advice. Mm-hmm. how like you frame it that way to give advice. That's why we're mostly experts as human on other people's problems, more so than our own. So I think take these three things in consideration, and hopefully that first workshop runs smoothly.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant advice, and really good reminders as well about the power of role playing. And I really like that suggestion around getting advice or recommendations from them, and that way you approach it and building that relationship, especially with more senior people who might be involved in the room, and then you've got them in the room and you're doing it, and they want you to succeed as well, right? Yeah, I love that. We had one final one that came through, which was about, and there's still time, folks, if you want to add anything. It was around the theme of habitualizing progress sharing, and it's going to decipher this one a little bit, but it was essentially, what formats do you think work best for product people to kind of share some of that progress? So you spoke to some of them, but from your experience in the companies you've worked with and the product people you work with, like, what are some of those best ways of those tips and tricks in terms of sharing progress of what you're working on, what's coming up next? Like, is it all hands demos? Is it a mixture? Is it in casual coffee chats? Like, how would you, what's your advice on what you would share?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging because the context matters, and the rituals have to be aware of the culture, the organizational culture and context that you're in. So I wouldn't say it's like a bulletproof one. I think the key point is the predictability around it. Having your partners understand that you might be coming for a sprint planning session and what to expect, bringing them into maybe prioritization, but doing that consistently. Having already scheduled a reoccurring, let's say, product demo when you ship something. If you're creating reports on, let's say, your OKRs and your progress around them. So I think the key thing is less about the rituals. It's about that these rituals fit the organizational context. People do enjoy them. They give you the feedback around them. They feel that they're heard, and doing that in a predictable manner so they can actually plan ahead.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. We're getting some good feedback around the tactics as well. Like, it's really, really helpful to hear these kind of your experience on it and tactics. So that looks about it. Some great questions from the audience. Thank you very much for sending those through. I've got some other kind of thoughts here in terms of people going through. So I think with that, so Elsawy, thank you so much for talking us through this conversation today. It was absolutely brilliant. Hope to have you back with us again. Any final kind of parting thoughts on your side before I wrap up?
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the audience. Really appreciate the opportunity, and I enjoyed this presentation. So thank you, everyone.